On today's I Wonder, we are going to talk about how the pillars of explicit parenting apply to the college application process for you and your kid, even if college isn't involved. In other words, what can I do as a parent to get through the latter years of high school and whatever process of lifting off out of the nest is in our future, with my own sanity and my relationship with my kid fully intact? Let's dive right in. So just as a refresher, if you haven't listened to any of these episodes before, the 4 principles of explicit parenting are to know yourself, to know your relationship, to be curious, not judgmental, and to be consistent and persistent. In other words, tune in now and tune in then. Listen more than you talk and choose intentional steps as often as you can. So let's start with know yourself. But before we get to that, I want to say one thing about why I'm talking about this. So yes, I'm a psychologist who works in private practice very often with parents and with adolescents. So I've seen both sides of this time period that we're talking about. And I've garnered some things over the years about what works well and what doesn't. In addition, I have gone through 2 college processes with my 2 children in wildly different states. My oldest was during COVID, right in the thick of COVID. My middle one had the end of their junior year, their high school closed. So they spent their senior year at a school they were not particularly fond of. And it was a social and emotional struggle to even think about what was next when everything was feeling so icky in the moment. My last one is a rising senior. So we have entered this process with that child in a quote unquote normal time. And so we're doing this for the 3rd time, but also in some ways for the first time, not only because the times are different, but he's very different. And so I feel personally qualified to speak about this as well as professionally because of the things that I've seen and heard in my practice over the years. Not anything recently necessarily, but over the years. So let's begin. Knowing yourself. So really what that means when I said before is tune in now to how you're feeling and also tune in then. This period of transition can bring up a lot of old stuff for us if we have any kind of experience with college ourselves or not going to college ourselves. So we can have things that are triggers that we might be surprised by. We can have expectations that we might not have known we have. We can have thoughts about how it should go, how it shouldn't go. We can have thoughts about ourselves that are intricately tied to this process and the outcomes for our kids. It's important that we tune in and know that because it's going to affect your relationship with your child if your own stuff gets in the way. So don't only tune into what will come up for you or what could come up for you based on your own experience, but also tune in and talk to your partner about what are your expectations, not only for this process, but for this kid. What are your expectations for their future? And are they based on only your hopes and dreams, or are they based on the kids' hopes and dreams? And how recently have you talked about any of that? It's important to have the hard conversations with yourselves in order to make the conversations with your students easier down the road. Knowing your relationship. So this step, when I'm working with parents of small children, I have them think about what they want their life to look like when they're sitting by the lake or on a beach or on a ski slope with their older kid. So when their 4-year-old is 20, what do they want their life to feel like? What do they want that relationship to look like and feel like? How do they want to go get along with their child when their child is grown? That's a really helpful tool to be able to understand how you have to shift your behavior when your kids are young in order to build that relationship. It's never too late. And also, it should be something that we're kind of constantly checking in about. How do I want this relationship to go? We started this episode by saying, how do these principles apply so that you can keep your relationship intact? Believe it or not, you can actually grow your relationship through this process too. You are now at a place where your kids are transitioning into young adulthood. They're getting more independent. You're having to learn how to let go. What is that going to mean for the 2 of you going forward? And do you want it to be contentious and argumentative? Do you want them to know you respect and believe in them? Or do you just want it to go your way? These are the tough conversations that we talked about in the first part of it that continue in for what do I want with this child going forward? What do I want our relationship to look like and feel like? If you have an idea of how you want things to go, it will help inform how the decisions and the conversations that you have with your student, with your child. So check in with yourself, remind yourself, or ask yourself for the first time how you want your relationship to look, how you want it to feel. And is it happening now? And can it happen in the future? And what needs to change or what needs to happen when you move into that later? This is my favorite one. Being curious, not judgmental. And yes, I had this in my book long before the Ted Lasso show even aired. So I like to take credit for this one. But curious, not judgmental is really just what I tell parents all the time. Ask questions and really try to fight the urge to give your kid all the knowledge that you can right now. One of the things that comes up for a lot of parents, myself included, at this time where we're getting ready to sort of send them out of the nest is this really difficult to fight urge to just dump everything we haven't taught them already onto them in this last year. You start to think about things like, how are they going to pay bills? How are they going to do laundry? How are they going to know where to get to their classes? How are they going to know, depending on your level of involvement in their schooling up to this point, this might be the very first time they're doing anything on their own. And even if it's not, my kids were wildly independent. I always joke that I don't even know the login to those school websites where you check their grades and check their assignments and stuff. Never even learned the logins because my thought was that was their responsibility, not mine. I'd find out if their grades were bad when it was time for me to find out when their grades were bad. That said, there are some of you for various reasons, whether the kids, that's the needs that they have, or they're just, you've always sort of been on top of them for that. And that's how it has worked for you. If that has been your dynamic, and even if it hasn't, again, I'm the first person to say this, there is this urge to say, oh my gosh, I have 9 months left with them, or two school years left with them, and I need to dump everything I can into them right now. There is also a really strong urge to say, well, I've raised this person since birth. I know who they are. I know what's best for them. I know what's good for them. I know what they should do. And these childish things that they're suggesting are just because their brain's not fully developed. Again, as a psychologist and somebody who knows brain development, I still fell into that trap sometimes with my own kids. This idea that, this is a crazy thought. They haven't thought this through. They don't know from beginning to end. They don't know what'll happen. They don't know how the dominoes fall if they make this choice. So I have to tell them. In those moments, if you can, fight that urge and bite back that urge, and instead ask them questions, not in a snarky way, not in a sarcastic way, but in a way that has them helping you to understand where they're coming from. Because the trick here is that not only will they help you understand, but they will have to examine it themselves. And you might actually get the results that you wanted by having them examine it themselves. We all know teenagers are gonna fight us if they feel like we're imposing our beliefs on them. But if you truly are trying to understand them, it gives them not only an opportunity to tell you who they are, but an opportunity to really examine for themselves who they are. When given that opportunity, they shine almost every time. So ask more questions than you give advice. Try not to judge them. Try not to assume you know who they are and what's best for them. And instead, ask a whole lot of questions to help them get their minds moving on there too. You are building the scaffolding that they need to move into the next phase so that they can slowly remove all of those support pieces. Not the connection between the two of you, but just the shell you've built around them to help get them to this point. I'll share a little story before I get to the last point. My middle one, who I explained at the beginning of this, was a junior having the greatest year because sophomore year was fully remote for COVID. Junior year, they finally got back, even though they were in masks, they finally got back, and they loved their school like I've never known a person to love their school. They loved their teachers. They were one of the leads in the school play and the school musical. They just had an incredible year. And it was so fun to watch them blossom and sort of learn who they were. And in May, right around prom, they got a letter sent home that the school was closing. So as you might imagine, it was a bit of a social and emotional upheaval in our home, not only then, but in senior year when they had to go to a school that they didn't want to go to. I shouldn't say they didn't want to go. There were some factors that made it an okay school and the right choice. Some members of their class from their old school were going. They had a great theater program, and that was kind of their thing at the time. And so those types of things worked out, but the school itself was just not a fit at all for this child. And so we spent a lot of the year tiptoeing around them. And not in a way that like we were afraid, but in a way that I was like, there is a lot happening in that brain, and I don't want to overload it with things. They were part of the college process. They were a reluctant part, but they were part of the college process. The workload, we learned a lot about what it takes to apply to very different schools than their older sibling, because the older sibling had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do, and it was nothing like what the middle one wants to do. So we had learned a kind of a whole new process, which I'll get into in future episodes, the nitty gritty of the process. But we had to sort of handhold a little and step back a little and wait for them to sort of figure out their stuff and guide. And we've really sort of learned, again, that scaffolding portion of how do we give them just what they need without being overbearing, without pushing them into a state of freeze, without overwhelming them. And they also wanted to go to school in California. We live on the East Coast of the United States. They wanted to go to school in California, which, if you know anything, is very, very far away from their mother. So to kind of bring all of these pieces together, I had to really check in with myself, because my mother instinct was like, oh my gosh, no, you can't go out there. It's so far away. And that makes my heart fall down to the bottom of my stomach. The 17-year-old part of me thought, oh, I wanted to go to school in California. In fact, my kid applied to 2 of the schools I wanted to go to. And I really wanted to go to school in California. And my mother forbade it. She did not let me go. It wasn't even up for discussion. I wasn't allowed to apply. None of it happened. I also grew up on the East Coast, and she said no. So I could relate to her in this moment, because I thought, oh, here I am now feeling the same way. I don't want this kid to go to college out there. And also, I don't want this kid to feel like I felt at 17, which was like, I have no choice about where I'm going, and I have no option to go to the place I really want to go. So I had to have all that in my head and my heart, and tune in and figure out what I really needed, and figure out why I wanted what I wanted, and figure out how to best proceed forward. So all that. And the reality of the situation is those schools in California are wildly expensive and very hard to get into, sort of arbitrarily so. This kid is my kid that has all the test scores, all the grades, all the things. We figured they'd have no trouble getting in anywhere. That was not the case. So the California schools I also then was struggling with, how do I set this person up for realistic expectations so they're not completely devastated? And also, I'm not discouraging them from the beginning. And from a financial perspective, how do I let them know the reality of the situation? If you go here, this is going to include things like airfare and hotels, and you might not be able to come home for every holiday. And when your friends have their Halloween party that they've had every year since you were 5 and you love to attend, you probably won't go. How do I do that in a way that doesn't sound like I'm just saying, don't go there, it's too far away? Like, how do I give them this information? Remember, I talked about that urge to just dump all of the advice we could on them. How do I give them this information without making it seem like I'm trying to discourage them? So it took some subtle and some not so subtle conversations. At the end of the day, I think probably their older sister convinced them that it was too far. We were helped out by the fact that they only got into, I think, 1 or 2 of the 4 that they applied to. And both of those were off the wait list. So, in some ways, the choice was made for them. But it was a long 9 months of waiting to see if we were going to have to figure out this life, and also of trying to figure out how to create a scenario for this child that they could make an informed decision for themselves. Not easy. Took a lot of time tuning in, took a lot of questions asked on my part, and a lot of listening on my part. And also then a lot of I'm going to need a minute to myself to figure out how to best proceed forward. So that story sort of leads us into the 4th step, which is be consistent and persistent. And with early parenting, we know the power of consistency, right? A kid needs to hear things 1,000 times before they actually get it. That so that persistence is necessary in order to create routine. We know the power of routine. We know the power of consistently doing the same things days in and days out. So they kind of get that into their little bodies and brains too. With older kids, it's not so different, but there's one little subtle shift. The consistent and persistent part is really be consistent in the first 3 things I talked about and be persistent in doing it. So if you are consistently checking in with yourself, if you are consistently checking in with them to ask questions about it, if you're consistently examining your expectations and your criteria and your boundaries, and then you are persistent in in figuring out how to stay on top of them in a way that supports them, not overwhelms them, and then persistently do that. In the relationships portion of this, in knowing your relationships, when you have the difficult conversations with your partner, and we'll get more into this in the practical episodes that I'm going to do next, but I want to just mention this. When you and your partner, whoever else is helping you with this process, talk about, okay, what does this look like? What can we afford? What can't we afford? What do we want for them? What don't we want for them? When you have those conversations and you're solidified and you're on the same page, you then need to have those conversations with your kid. They all know that college is expensive. They all know that there's loans out there. They all know some of the ins and outs. There's videos on YouTube. They're talking about it in high school. It's around everywhere. If your expectation is my kid is going to a 4-year college and they're only going to a state school and they're only going this, you have to be open with them and honest with them about those things and why. And it's okay. There should not be any shame around your own boundaries about it. And once those are in place, you're consistently enforcing them and you're persistent in your dogged determination to get them to sort of be within your boundaries and their own. In addition, if college isn't the thing, you have to do all of these steps first to see how you feel about that and then how they feel about it. And then help them figure out what is next, because it doesn't have to be college, but probably neither one of you wants it to just be sitting in the bedroom playing video games till they're 25. And I'm not saying those are the options. What I'm saying is if a kid doesn't want to go to college or for whatever reason has something else, well, no, let me start with this. If a kid doesn't want to go to college, but they don't know exactly what they want to do, sometimes they're just like, we all kind of look around like, well, what do you do then? And that's not really fair because there's a million opportunities out there to do. So when we get to these practical episodes that I'm talking about, what to do junior year, what to do senior year, a lot of the same steps can apply to every kid, whether you're going to college or not, because it's about learning who you are and what lights you up and what you might be interested in pursuing. And you might not get there right away, but that's okay too. So as far as how this process of explicit parenting applies to the college process, I'm using the word college all the time, but really what I'm talking about is what happens when your adult child is getting ready to launch out of your nest. How do you help them do that? And how do you maintain your relationship in that area? So that consistent and persistent piece, once you've figured out, okay, well, it's okay if they don't want to go, or, maybe it doesn't feel okay to me that they're not going to go, but I know them and they're really excited about, esthetician school or, plumbing or something like that. And I have to keep my own self in check and support them in that. So how am I going to support them in that? And that's the consistent and persistent part, because every step of this process, you're going to take some time to re-examine your own expectations and beliefs and desires and dreams and all of that stuff. So if you're consistently tuning in, consistently checking in with them, and consistently asking questions rather than dumping advice, then you will be able to give them your wisdom and knowledge when necessary, because they don't know everything. They think they do. And sometimes because we know they think they do, we try to shut them down, but that's not okay either, because they do know some stuff and we need to let them tell us that. Educate us on what they do know and what they feel like they want to do and what they've learned. And then it will be easier when we feel like we know something that they don't, and we want to help understand that too. I just had a conversation, maybe even earlier today with my oldest about when she was a sophomore, she moved to an off-campus apartment that we thought was a terrible idea. And it was a beautiful apartment, lovely place, lovely roommate. She moved with her freshman year roommate who we adore. So that wasn't the problem, but it was this off-campus apartment that was like a complex with bunches of other students, but also it was way off campus. So it was also like some nurses and some people who worked in the nearby buildings and things like that. And it was really far from the center it wasn't really far from her academic building, but it was really far from the social center of campus. And she was, pretty determined to go there. So we just took the tack of sharing. Here's what we think. We think it's a bad idea for these reasons. It's really far. You're kind of isolated. If your roommate, who is close to everything she likes and does, isn't home, what are you going to do? And this is your decision. The rent was fine. We were helping with the rent, all of that. Like we couldn't tell her no because of that. Unfortunately, she had a car, so it wasn't like she couldn't get where she needed to go. But we thought we knew better. And we realized she had to learn this on her own. We couldn't tell her this. We couldn't make her do it so that she would not experience any hardship. And let me tell you, it was a hard year. She had a really hard year. She was really isolated. She felt really far away. All of the things we did might be, we were right. But you don't want to be right in that situation. You don't want your kid to hurt. And so sometimes you try to make things happen so they're not going to hurt. I don't know that she would tell you it was the right thing. Having watched her grow through that, I have no regrets about letting her learn that on her own, because she grew into this confident and, she knows how to take care of herself. She knows how to get her needs met. She knows when she needs to do certain things for her mental health. She understands herself a lot better. She will never live that far away from the center of the world again. And she might not have ever learned that if we made her do it. So we had to tune into our own stuff. We had to talk to each other about how we wanted this relationship to be. And then we had to talk to her and give her our advice and then back away and say, this is where you are in your life now. It's your turn to decide. And now we get to joke about how we were right all along. So, choosing questions instead of advice is probably your best bet nearly every time. And finally, tending consistently to your relationships. You and your partner, you and them, that tending means that those relationships only get better from here. So there you go. That is the way that the 4 steps of explicit parenting lend themselves to I'm not even going to say college process. I'm going to say the birds flying the nest process. If you liked what you heard, please share it with friends and let them know that this is the first in a series on preparing your kids for what's next in their grown-up future. We'll have more practical tips in the upcoming episodes for both juniors in high school and seniors in high school, as well as what to do after applications or what to do if college isn't in the plan. And then finally, if you heard anything helpful, consider checking out the groups I'm holding in the fall. I'm going to have a local group and I'm going to have an online group for parents of birdies about to fly the nest. And you can have a kid that's 2 years away from that, 1 year away from that, maybe has already done it. And you are feeling like, what do I do here? How do I manage this change and transition? I've seen it now over the last 4 years. I'm about to have a senior in college, and I've seen people go through this over the last 4 years just as a parent. And I think this group is something that we all really would love to have. So how do you let go and hold on to the good stuff all at the same time? You can find information about those groups at wonderinkwellness.com. Thanks so much for listening. If you found anything you liked, please share it with a friend. Don't forget to like, subscribe. And if you have a minute, leave a review. It just helps us to get this message out even further. Take care. Until next time, stay curious.